Hello, and welcome to Praxis and Theodicy. Today we're going to continue our study on usury. If you haven't watched the other videos in this series, I suggest doing so in order to build an understanding of the topic at hand. We'll spend a good portion of our time today exploring the question of what exactly is capitalism. Then we'll define where and how it is tied to usury, either as a functional practice or as a foundational one. This video took a while to produce because I made up my mind to read the book Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber before I continued on with this series. I will be pulling from this text a lot in this video in particular. The book speaks extensively of usury practices in world cultures throughout history, and it has confirmed, challenged, and expanded my own knowledge on the subject. This book has my full recommendation. Capitalism is a bit hard to define. A bit of this is a factor called capitalist realism, a term coined by Mark Fisher to describe, in his words, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Capitalist realism tends to provoke an incuriousness in those who live under it, and moves us to paint a false image of the past and an inability to see anything different in the future. Ultimately, it paints capitalism as the default of human economic relationships. This recontextualizes any alternative economic systems as if they are aberrations of the norm, instead of being exactly what they are, alternatives. So, the first step in defining and understanding capitalism is to make up your mind to think critically and objectively about economic systems and economic relationships between humans. Even in critical academic circles, it's hard to find any two definitions of capitalism that completely agree. Graeber writes, "The word was originally invented by socialists who saw capitalism as that system whereby those who own capital command the labor of those who do not. Proponents, in contrast, tend to see capitalism as the freedom of the marketplace, which allows those with potentially marketable visions to pull resources together to bring those visions into being." Just about everyone agrees, however, that capitalism is a system that demands constant, endless growth. I've tried my best to take a wide variety of definitions of capitalism and distill them down to the things that I believe are essential to it. This includes pruning off a lot of branches that I think might be essential parts of capitalism, but in the interest of being fair and objective, I've distilled it down to three components upon which capitalism depends. Take away any one of these components, and I believe you would have a different system entirely. These components are private property, competitive free markets, and investment. To expound on these, private property is a component of capitalism when it is the primary way of legally defining relationships between people. Free markets simply means that most citizens have equality under the law for participation in the economy. This freedom does not mean that any action in the economy is legally permitted. In fact, capitalism inevitably exposes the need for market regulation. However, by default, the regulation of what sort of products or services may be offered on the market by individuals is meant to be regulated by natural selection rather than legislation. The free market also does not mean that all people have the equal ability to participate fully in economic ventures. It only means that they are equal under the law. In practical terms, all people under capitalism are very often strictly not equally able to fully participate in the economy. This is a result of the true operating adjective of this point, competitive. A competitive market means that all participants have the freedom to undermine and reduce the power of other participants, and are in fact incentivized to do so. Although capitalism could exist with regulated competition, a free competitive market would allow and encourage all actors to exploit any and all advantages they have in the competition against others who do not share that advantage. Investment is the main point we want to focus on. Investment is a cycle of using your wealth to empower enterprises to create more wealth on a contract that you have a right to claim a share of the wealth that is produced. These 3 points produce a system where those who conquer more property are incentivized to find ways to bring it onto the market in order to produce more money which can be exchanged for more profit-extracting property. Certain kinds of property can be used to produce wealth. A rich, fertile farmland can grow food. a high-tech industrial factory can produce automobiles. These pieces of property are called capital. Socialists call this specific type of property private property, but we're not using that nomenclature in this video. For our purposes, any property that can be leveraged to produce products that can be sold for money are referred to as capital. Private property is an institution borrowed from ancient Roman law, and it's defined, as Graeber puts it, property, or dominum, is a relationship between a person and a thing, characterized by absolute power of that person over that thing. There's a lot more to the concept of private property that we don't have time to cover in this video. Another important note is that capital itself cannot produce wealth. Human labor is always and forever the crucial component needed to actually leverage the capital in the right way to create wealth. In many ways of looking at capitalism, this logically leads to the assumption that human labor, or in fact humans themselves, are in fact capital. And at certain points in capitalism's history, human beings, under certain conditions, were considered to be up for grabs as capital and in fact as private property. The continuation of this is that human labor, not human beings themselves, is still a sort of capital that can be purchased. It's a rather nebulous sort of capital since, unlike traditional property, it's a nebulous, intangible thing rather than a physical object. Now, we need primarily to talk about investment. Investment is a factor that may appear broadly under many economic systems. In fact, it can be seen as foundational to any free market system. However, capitalism operates with a different goal which fundamentally makes it quite distinct from a free market economy. Graeber calls to an older historian as he writes, "We're used to assuming that capitalism and markets are the same thing, but as French historian Fernand Braudel points out, in many ways they could equally well be conceived as opposites. While markets are easy ways of exchanging goods through medium of money, capitalism, for Braudel, is first and foremost the art of using money to get more money. Normally, the easiest way to do this is by establishing some kind of formal or de facto monopoly. To illustrate this, a traditional free market, that is, a market which everyone can participate in, is usually used so that people can use the tools they have available to produce something that they can trade for money. They use that money to buy things that improve their life. Capitalism, by contrast, is a system under which its participants are first and foremost concerned with gaining more money. The commodities they buy are not a good unto themselves, but more tools that can produce wealth. What we are referring to as capital. The purpose of capital is only to produce more money. Braudel argued that capitalists are not typically the romanticized entrepreneurs who wanted to operate in a competitive market, but were more successful and realized when they became monopolists. If competitive markets are a game, monopolies can be seen as winning that game. Graeber talks about this dichotomy between the market actor and the capitalist. That relationship between the daring adventurer on the one hand, the gambler willing to take any sort of risk, and on the other, the careful financier, whose entire operations are organized around producing steady, mathematical, inexorable growth of income, lies at the very heart of what we now call capitalism. Capitalism relies on investment, and that is where we focus our attention. Investment is most often primarily a source of income that does not rely on the earner performing labor. This description, in fact, is a perfect summary of acting capitalism, using your money in a way that makes more money for yourself, despite the fact that money itself is not a productive instrument. Recall the definition given at the Fifth Lateran Council, for that is the real meaning of usury, when, from its use, a thing which produces nothing is applied to the acquiring of gain and profit without any work, any expense, or any risk. It's not a coincidence that the rise of capitalism coincided closely with the fall of usury prohibitions coming from the church or the state. Capitalism began in the age of merchants and colonies, and the high risk was all that allowed investments to take off in a big way. But it immediately was used as not more than an excuse to gamble recklessly and make an easy buck off of shifting prices and speculations without putting in the time to perform labor yourself. But risk was a big factor. The first Ponzi scheme took place almost immediately after an experiment with free markets in France in the years before the Revolution. In early 1700s London, the South Sea Company became a template for market speculation and literal day traders, and, as Graeber sums it up, thousands grew rich, thousands more were ruined. Risk was there from the beginning, but did it ensure that private investments were a safe, ethical, responsible way to manage an economy? We've mostly laid the groundwork here for what capitalism is. We'll look a little more closely at the relationship between capitalism and usury in the next video when we zoom in on the most recent iteration of capitalism, a massive investment scheme called neoliberalism.